Maybe that next slide is perfect. So good morning, everyone. Just as a kind of welcome activity as we wait for other team members to join us, if you could participate here in a couple of tasks. The first one being if you could rename yourself on your Zoom link, or if you're in a team, just labeling who you are. We're going to do some collaboration and breakouts, and it'll be helpful to see where these ideas are coming from and what some of our kind of network of friends are thinking about. So that first task of renaming yourself with the participant link there's some directions. And then the second piece is just an activity to get us primed for some discussion around literacy, which is for you to reflect on what is the first book you remember reading, or your favorite book if you're really into something right now, and just a brief example of why. If you type that into the chat, again, we'll just get started with the content here in a minute. Want to give everyone a chance to get landed. All right. Please continue to add those literacy recommendations and activating prior knowledge, some of your early literacy experiences. Thank you for humoring us in this welcome activity. As you know, literacy is our jam. And for those of you who I haven't had the privilege of meeting, my name is Ryan Blasquez. I'm the new director of Oregon ORTIi project, and this is my first year in the role, and it's coupled with my new role as an instructional services director at Northwest Regional ESD. We serve Tillamook, Clatsop, Columbia, and Washington counties with a whole bunch of things. And Northwest Regional has been lucky enough to bring the project on, and we're excited about all the partnering that we can do with the team and tapping into their knowledge about all things literacy, and including why it's so important to think about the whole child and their support systems and family systems, the communities they navigate when we're building our instructional programs, which is, of course, what we'll go deeper with here this morning. So I didn't want to start without highlighting our vision for our project. The reason we exist, why the Department of Ed keeps renewing our funding, and hopefully a part of why you're here, is we believe every child in every district will receive instruction and support they need and deserve every day to become a reader. And while I'm new to this team, what's become really evident to me is this is the vision we anchor in, planning for stuff like today, the coaching we do. This is our core belief in the way we do business. So while I'm new to this team, I want to share I was a teacher, a TOSA special ed director, and most recently an elementary school principal at Charles F. Tigard in Tigard, Tualatin. And it's really that principal lens which makes me excited about this content here today. As a principal of an elementary school, I was always challenged by the fact I knew how important it was to get the feedback and share leadership with my community. And as you all know, keeping systems like that going is really time and work intensive. And that challenge was compounded every year by the fact that in elementary school, in all of your settings, you're losing partners. 100 fifth grade families every year we're leaving, bringing in 100 families of 5-year-olds. So by the time we're identifying parent leaders and getting things rolling, families know what to expect. Then they're off to middle school. We were kind of onboarding again. And I was at a school that was receiving title funding, so there were requirements around parent and community involvement, parent compact stuff, which I'm sure many of you know. But it took time, energy, and some trial and error to kind of get that right. And so a quick example was we used to hold these 2 literacy nights and a Dr. Seuss read aloud night each year. And it kind of checked the boxes for our compliance stuff. And we had info tables and agreements and attendance contracts, and we'd set out all the textbooks and talk about interventions and all that stuff. I had to wear the damn Dr. Seuss hat all the time, and it checked the boxes. But after our second year, it was obvious that the same 80 families were coming for everything. And this is a school of 600 kids. And that included PSO events, coffee and conversation with the principal, et cetera. And so that led our leadership to some inquiry. We'd interview families, survey, do some intentional outreach to historically underserved families. And what our leadership heard was that families were way more likely to show up if they knew the work was specifically about their child and their child's reading success, not just this overview stuff. So we pivoted and made some changes. And we changed the dates of our nights to line up with fall and winter screening data. We had students fill out, instead of sending out a literacy night, they had individual like invites to Stella's reading night or Johnny's reading night. And it detailed how parents would have like this one-on-one structured conversation. Students were prepared to talk about their literacy scores, the challenges that they were having, the things they were feeling really positive about. And parents were given like language frames, and kids were prepared to answer those things. And then at the end, we would do some kind of guided goal setting with teachers. And so we were a little more flexible in the time. They could stay for 15 minutes or an hour. We had book raffles. We kept it looser than we previously had. And we still had all the info tables, and the Dr. Seuss had stuff too. But big surprise, we had 90% of our families consistently showing up to these after that. When we personalized our events, and we drew that line directly to their student success. So that's, again, just an example of some of the things we might think through today. And lastly, there's this other thing that happens, which many of you know, when families see that we're responsive to them and to their child. It's really disarming. It builds trust, and you get that social capital for when inevitably things are going to get hard in a school year. So again, a personal, local, immediate example, that worked in our community. And the trick is just figuring out ways to be responsive in yours. And so just really appreciate everybody being here today, and appreciate the team for helping me learn along with them. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. So we're all very excited to have Ryan as a part of the team and leading some of this work, and we'll look forward to continuing to do that. So today, as Ryan kind of set the stage, really this is our guiding question. How are we going to improve our partnerships with families and community members, specifically around literacy? And so we use the word improve there because we know that you already have some of those partnerships. So it's not about like creating new things necessarily, although with some families you do need to create new partnerships, but it's about improving the systems that you have. So we want to think about these three questions as we go through today, and we'll address these. We want to think about why are partnerships important, and you all have your personal why around that, but we're going to talk about some of the research around that. What are we going to partner around? So what is the content that we want to share with our families and partner with them and the community around? Is it, do we want to share information about what our overall literacy program is? Do we want to share information about interventions? What do we do when kids struggle? The data, all those things. So talking about what we want to partner around. And then how do we do that? There's multiple ways to connect with families through written form, through personal meetings, through phone calls, through events. Like there's lots of things to do. So we want to think about how we can partner to share that information. And we're going to have you start to work on this to develop and refine, what we call standards of practice for how we improve that family and community partnerships around literacy. Again, you have a lot of this work happening. And so what we want to support you all in doing is making that work more systemic. So making it last, making it not dependent on a person here or a person there, but having some agreements around what that looks like. Several of the districts that are here with us today, you have multiple elementary schools. And so how do we make that consistent to some extent across our elementary schools in the ways that we're communicating? So it's not the educational lottery where if my kid goes to this school, I'm going to have a real close relationship. If I go to this school, across the district, they don't talk to families and communities at all, or they're getting a different message about the literacy system. So we want a similar message from our schools in our district. So this morning, this is kind of the format of how we're going to walk through it. So there's going to be two kind of main sections of content that we're going to kind of talk through. And the first one is, how do we partner with all our families? So we want to think about that tiered level of supports for our kids that we provide. We also want to think about a tiered level of supports and tiered level of partnership with families, because there's some things that all families are going to need to know. Think about your whole reading program, maybe the assessments that you give. Some of those things are things that you need to communicate and partner with all families. But there's some information that not all families need. For example, if students are really struggling and need some additional interventions, some families are going to need more information around what does progress monitoring data look like? What do we do, if we need to look at the special education evaluation? So we want to think about how do we partner with some families, as well as how do we partner with the community? So we'll have these two big sections, and then you're going to get a big chunk of work time in between each of those sections with your team to work on some questions that we raise. And we have a graphic organizer, a tool that we'll share in a little bit that you can use for that. So thinking about as we, in a little while we'll transition that, think about roles for your team. I know some of you are all in the virtual space. I know some of you are in a room together, but think about, is someone going to take notes on that graphic organizer? Who's going to keep you on track? Who's going to facilitate? And we want you to be prepared to share out some things, through the chat when you get back from those team times. And then the Oregon RTI coaches will be available. So if you need us to pop into a breakout room to answer questions, work with you, we'll probably pop in and out of breakout rooms anyway. But you can let us know through the chat if you need some support for your coach. All right. So thinking about just where this fits, many of you have seen this, but this is our kind of graphic around MTSS, all the features. So we're really talking specifically today about this community and family partnerships. How do we support all the work that you're doing? How do we communicate, and how do we partner with our families and communities to make sure it's going to meet the needs of all of our students and families? So many of you have filled out this district rubric. If you haven't seen this before, that's okay. Someone in your district has completed this. But this is about, looking at which pieces are strong around family and community partnerships and which are not. And so today, if you filled out that rubric, this is really what we're going to talk about. Just how do we develop agreements or standards of practice around them? And then how do we look at and resolve barriers to families and communities being our partners? So policies, funding, time, how do we look at those things? What we're not going to look about today is, how do we train our staff on those things? How do we monitor how those things are going? Really, right now, we're just looking at and having discussions about what do we want our partnerships to look like? All right. So why do we need to strengthen our family community partnerships? There is a whole host of benefits from the research and what we know around what works and what's going to benefit our kids for having those tight family and community connections. And so all of these things are going to be important. The research shows, attendance is better, attitudes are better, teachers have higher expectations. All of these things, it's just a better environment for families and communities, and students are more successful when that happens. So real quick, just as you read through these, what I want you to do is just put in the chat why you see the need to strengthen family and community partnerships in your district. Maybe it's something on this list that has resonated for you, or maybe it's some other why in terms of what you've seen around strong family and community partnerships and where that has improved student success. So just 30 seconds or so, just throw in the chat there a phrase or a word or something about why you feel the need to strengthen the family and community partnerships in your particular district. Yeah, more student success, work together. Positive attitude towards school, absolutely. Higher student achievement. Yeah, all those things are going to be important. It is really supportive to the student and increases student success exponentially when we partner. So keep throwing those in the chat, and we're going to move on. There's another quick activity I want us to all do before we move into the next level of content. So what I want you to do now is I want you to shift gears a little bit. We're going to take about 5-ish minutes with your team, and then we're going to come back together. So we're going to send you into breakout rooms to think about this. And then there's actually, if you click on the link there, there's a Jamboard that I want you to fill out, put some sticky notes on there with your ideas as you come through these. So there's a Jamboard for each one of these questions. I want you to think about your thoughts. So essentially what we want you to do is I want you to think about what ideal family and community partnerships in your school district would look like. So imagine, now, 5 years from now, whenever it is, you just have fantastic partnerships. Everything's going great. You want to just spread the word and share with everyone how great partnerships are. Families are engaged, communities engaged. You've got best case scenario. Couldn't get any better. I want you to think about these questions. So in that scenario, what are the school staff doing? Like, what are the activities? How are they communicating? What are the things that they're doing? That's the first Jamboard. So as you rotate through, there's 3 pages. The second one is, what are families and communities members doing? So how are they engaging? How are they supporting their students at home? What would you like to see from them? And then the last one is around which families and community members are going to be included in that. And that's kind of a loaded question because we're most likely going to say, well, all families and communities, right? So we want to make you think a little bit deeper and think about how are you going to ensure that all families are included? Because it's not just about, some families, that show up all the time being and saying we have good partnerships, but it's about all families. So how do you ensure that that happens? All right, I think everyone's back in the room. So don't have a lot of time to share out, a lot of good stuff that people put on the Jamboard just around literacy nights, about how we get folks engaged. Really, this activity was meant just to get you thinking around what does family and community engagement mean to you? Because it means something different to different schools, to different families. There's no like standard one way of saying that this is what you have to do. And so we want you to keep this at your forefront, these questions around what are you all going to do? What do you want your families and communities? How do you want them to partner? And how are you going to make sure that you're including all families and not just those families that continually show up or that it's easy for them to show up? How do we reach all of our families? So be thinking about these questions as we go through today. And I'll hand it over to Beth.
Yeah, and I think another important thing about this is to think about how would your families answer these questions as well, right? And this might be an activity that you could do with families too, of what is the ideal that they see happening. So how do we move from that ideal that you were just envisioning right now to ensuring that those couple of practices that you really want to anchor in are able to be, that you are ensuring that they're happening kind of for every child, for every family across your setting? What are those kind of minimum things you want to make sure are happening of kind of how we do school and how we do partnerships in our setting? And then thinking about those good things that are already happening in certain pockets in your setting. How are we scaling those as well? Because we know that they are having a good impact. So just like you've done with all the other components of your MTSS over the past 5 or 6 years, you're going to start by developing some standards of practice around how we are partnering with families and how we're engaging with families and the community around literacy. And so once you've developed those standards of practice, then how are we going to provide professional learning for our staff, both initial professional learning and then ongoing, especially as we bring new staff in or need to change some things about our standards of practice. And then how are we going to monitor what we have decided are those high impact practices that we want to be scaling. And then all of that within that continuous cycle of improvement. So as we're monitoring it, knowing, is it working? Is it having the impact we want it to? For whom is it impacting? And for whom is it maybe not having the impact we want? And what do we need to change a little bit? So what we're mostly going to be talking about today, just because we only have 2 hours and time goes very quickly, is some ideas around those standards of practice. We're not going to really talk much at all about professional learning and monitoring, except very briefly. So why do we need standards of practice? It's really about ensuring that everybody is on the same page with what we're doing, that we have a consistent and clear message, that the new people know what's happening in our communities. And having that clear and consistent message right now is especially important. The wider world now is more aware of how we may have been teaching reading in the past that has not been effective for most students. It's in all kinds of media, whether it's the Sold the Story podcast or in the New York Times, in US News and World Report, just kind of everywhere about that kind of reading crisis and what's been happening over the last generation or so of reading instruction. And so how are we giving our message out that we are teaching reading in an effective evidence-based way? And then certainly we have all seen the news in the past week or two around Oregon-specific reading challenges over the last 2 years and what's happened to our reading outcomes for our students, and that we have lots of conversation around that. I even have an elderly, retired, childless friend who texted me when he saw this in the Oregonian and said, "What are you doing about this?" It's like, well, I'm trying, I think that's what we all are all saying. We all have a system in place, those of us who have been doing this work for a long time. So it's how are we ensuring families that we do have a system for both improving our instruction and helping kids who are struggling to learn to read. So as we develop those standards of practice, just a quick reminder of why we need them, and it's to strengthen those partnerships. Like John said before, to ensure that we have systems in place to hear parent concerns, so that they don't feel like nobody listens to me. And what is that consistent message that we have for families in the community from all of our staff? And then it's also important, as we've talked about having that professional learning aspect to this, that we're supporting staff with conveying the message, not just saying you need to do this, but also giving them the tools and support and maybe some coaching and practice for delivering some of these messages, because sometimes it's hard, right? Sometimes it's hard to have conversations with families when the data doesn't show what we would like it to show. And so having some opportunities to help support people with that. What do our standards of practice need to reflect? They need to reflect that differentiated two-way communication, and John alluded to that a little bit. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then also that plan for increasing just overall family and community knowledge about literacy. How are we going to do these standards of practice? Well, that's why you all are here today, to get a start on that and having your DILT team begin to come up with those standards of practice, those couple of things that we want to ensure are happening across our setting. And we have asked you over the past, especially the past 2 to 3 years, to ensure that we are including family and community voice as we build our MTSS system, right? Ensuring that we are building with and not for families. You've heard us say this multiple times over the past 2 years. This time we really mean it, right? No, it's really important this time because we are building standards of practice around how we're communicating with the community. So we do definitely want to have community voice as we're building these standards of practice. And like John said, not just the ones who show up all the time, but how are we seeking out those voices that we definitely need to hear from because they are not as loud, and we really want to hear what they have to say. So for sure, this time, having community voice as we're developing our standards of practice. And then once we've developed them, how are we training and supporting them with staff and monitoring to ensure that they are having impact and for whom they are having impact? So it's not an RTI training without some triangles. So here they are. And as we talk about that differentiated two-way communication, what we're talking about is how are we communicating with all families? Can all families hear from us? What do we want to hear from all families? And these arrows are kind of about those feedback loops. And then a little bit more support that some families may need. And we'll talk about what those some families might be in your setting. And then with a few families who might need even more intensified and individualized communication, both to and from those families. And then all of that within the broader context of the whole community where we are situated, and hearing from our community and communicating with our community about literacy in general, and about how we are really getting at ensuring that all the citizens in our community are able to read. So you may have hopefully gotten this a couple days ago, and then I had it in the chat again earlier, and maybe if one of my colleagues can drop it in one more time. This is a graphic organizer that may or may not work well for your team. Use it as you want, or whatever else you're doing to keep track of your notes for today. We would appreciate that you would share it with your coach as you get a little bit further into this process. So as we go through these next couple of sections, Nicole and I are going to talk about that differentiated communication. And you might jot down in this, what are we already doing, and what are some ideas that the ORTIi team shared with us that we might want to do or add on or do differently. But again, we don't know your communities as well as you do. So also thinking about, how do most families want to be engaged in this community, and what are we missing? What else do we need to know? And then during your team time, you'll be able to answer some of these questions. Do we need to adjust something that we're already doing in this area? What are some quick wins that we could do that won't take a huge amount of work, but could have some high impact? And then what are our longer term goals? And what are some barriers and assets in doing this work? So if this graphic organizer works for your team, great. If you have a better way of taking notes, that's also fine. We just ask that you share them with us. So starting out with the all families, the big green triangle, and we're going to start with what all families can share with us. Because remember, we said this needs to be two-way communication. So they can share information about their child. They can share information about their family and the literacy practices in their family. Do they enjoy reading together as a family? Do they go to the library all the time? Or is reading somewhat of a struggle for people in their family as well? And what are they noticing about their child? What celebrations do they have about things that they've noticed their child being able to do? And what are some of the challenges that they've noticed? And this has been a huge thing, especially during the distance learning and more of a virtual school, where people were noticing that their child was really struggling to be able to read. And so people had questions about this. And then all families can also share with us how they best access information from the school. Do they prefer information from social media? Do they like direct emails? Do they like printed things because they don't have great internet access? Are videos helpful for them? Just gauging from them what's the best way to get information about literacy for you and your family. And then really importantly, feedback on the materials that we are using. Are families finding themselves reflected in the materials that we are using? Are they learning about other parts of the world in the materials that we are using? Do they find these materials easy to use? Especially a lot of programs have some really great home activities, but they're not always easily accessible and they can be confusing for families. So getting feedback on all of those things from all families would be great. And then what can we share with all families? In our conversations with a lot of the parent advocacy groups, and really thinking about this myself as a parent, I really wanted to know, is my kid reading? Are they reading on grade level? And how are they teaching reading? And what are they doing if my kid is struggling? And how big is the problem? All of those things are really strong questions that all families really have, because they know that literacy is really important. And then they also often want to know, how can I help at home? Knowing that it is the expectation that we are teaching reading in the school, but that there are activities families can do at home that maybe have more impact than just saying to them, oh, read 20 minutes, because that might not be the best fit for their child. And so we know what they're asking about. They don't necessarily know this, but they're really asking, what sort of system do you have in place to ensure that this is happening? And we actually know we have a system, right? We have the system that we've been building. And so it's kind of like we need to explain how MTSS works. So thinking about how we're explaining what we are doing at the school, how we are teaching reading using evidence-aligned practices and materials, and that we are doing somewhere between 90 and 120 minutes in elementary school and a full literacy block in the middle schools to teach literacy, and how we're differentiating during that core block based on student need. And then how do parents know if it's working and whether their child is on target and on grade level? And we need to explain how our assessment system works. What are our screening processes? What do they tell us? What does it mean to be an indicator? All of those things, and really helping families understand kind of where their child is on that path to becoming a reader. And then other assessments that we may be doing that will help inform our families. And then that question of, if my child is not reading on grade level, what are you going to do about it, right? And that's when we can have that conversation about what reading interventions are. And Nicole will talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but that we do have systems in place, whether it's the differentiation during core, whether it's reading interventions, more individualized. It's just really explaining how MTSS works. And then thinking about how families can help at home. Like I said, being a lot more specific about that. What are some routines that we're using in school that we could teach families in order for them to reinforce, such as how to do a multisyllabic spelling routine. If a kid is sitting at their kitchen table doing some homework and asked how to spell Fantastic. How are we teaching that at school? We're teaching chunking out the syllables. What's the first syllable, second syllable, third syllable? If we teach that to parents, they can be more effective in supporting their children at home. Same thing with what we used to call sight words, and now we're calling heart words. What's the piece of the word that's tricky? Or Newberg, I know they're called tricky words. Can we teach parents the routines around those so that they can better support at home? And also, how can families build a supportive literacy environment in their homes? And then thinking about what are some free resources that might be available in their community, keeping in mind that just because something is free or it's online, that doesn't necessarily mean it's accessible to all families. So how are we really differentiating what kinds of support that they might need to be able to access those things? And then also holding some engaging community literacy events. Like Ryan said at the beginning, some of the things you've been doing for a really long time, you're getting very few people coming to them. And so what are some ways that you can improve the events that you're happening so that they are better attended, and also building that knowledge about literacy, how people learn to read. I know that there have been family groups, and I think somebody on this call today is going to give this a go in the next couple of weeks, doing a family activity around Scarborough's reading rope, and just explaining what are all the things that go into reading. And when parents understand that, you know, like John said, attendance can get better because they're like, oh goodness, they are doing a lot at school to help my child become a better reader. And then also having maybe a topic around reading data, celebrating the growth that we made. I know a lot of you have had some amazing recovery growth in the, you know, by the end of last year, things weren't looking as terrible as we thought they were going to be. So celebrating that, but also continuing to share what is our plan for improvement. And like Ryan said before, if you have some activities at your event where people can make and take something, learn a routine, and then that you are recording those for families who aren't able to attend, and maybe you have them posted on your website so that families can, if they weren't able to be there, can still take advantage of them. One of the items in the folder of resources today, I don't want you to go digging through this yet because we still have things to say, but is this document from Michigan that looks at some of the things that you may already be doing to involve families in the community that might be more on this low impact side, and how to have a higher impact. And this document is really nice because it goes all the way from preschool to 12th grade. And so those of you who are here from the middle school crowd, there are things in here that you can take advantage of as well. And then thinking of some quick wins. And when we say quick wins, we don't want to say, okay, we're just going to check these off the list and say we've done them. It's things that you might be able to do a little bit more quickly because it's just tweaking something you're already doing, but still being in that continuous cycle of improvement and always asking yourself, for whom is it working and for whom is it not? But some quick wins that might be available for you is having some sort of parent-friendly overview of MTSS. This is something that we asked you to make a couple of years ago. If you haven't gotten to it yet, that's okay. In the folder, we have some good samples of that. But having that parent-friendly overview that you are either sharing aloud or sending home. And then sharing screening data at conferences. I know most of you are doing this now more than you were before. And we have included a checklist with a little script, and you might want to invite people to practice this at a staff meeting, just to become more fluent with how to get through the screening data. Simple things like getting screening letters translated into the languages used by your folks. You know, a lot of the systems, you can get a language or a letter translated into Spanish. You can just click a button and it'll be in Spanish. But what about the other languages that are represented in your community? Is there somebody who can translate those so that those can be sent home easily? And like I said, providing more videos and guided practice, and some parent videos about reading. In the folder, there's lots of those, so you don't have to reinvent them, but they are there. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff. And like we said before, you probably have some awesome things that are already happening. So what we want to do then is give you about 20 minutes to think through the all families piece of this. What are we already doing? What might we need to adjust? What are some of the quick wins? What are some of the barriers?
So we're going to move on to another aspect of differentiated two-way communication, and that is the communication that we have with some families. So certain groups of families that share a distinguishing characteristic. So specifically today, we're going to talk about families of students who are not yet on benchmark, families who speak another language at home. And we're not going to go into it today, but it's really important to also consider other groups of families that you have in your school community that may need additional communication or have some specialized characteristics or interests that would be beneficial to address. So again, thinking through your own context, what are some unique groups that you could communicate with? So for families of students who are not yet on benchmark, there's a lot of things that they can share with us and that we would love to know about their family. And so one of those things is family history of reading challenges. We know that dyslexia and reading challenges does tend to run in families. And so if we know that information, it can help support our students that we're serving, but also perhaps even providing resources and support to the families themselves, if that is something that's desired. The current Oregon dyslexia legislation requires tapping into this information and accessing it for kindergarten and first grade, but of course, it is useful information to have regardless of what grade level the student is at this time. Another thing that we can inquire to our families is get some idea about their child's feelings and perceptions about reading and their relationship to reading and their relationship to having reading being a challenge. So relatedly, we also want to know about the student's specific motivations and interests. And with those two pieces of information, we can kind of build a more holistic approach to supporting students and utilizing and leveraging things that they're really interested and captivated in to help support reinforcing learning the skill of reading and maybe utilizing text that is more high interest. And so again, it just offers another perspective that we wouldn't really necessarily have if we didn't talk to families or students when they're older as well about their perceptions. So there are also things that we can share with families from the school staff perspective. So things that we're doing at school. So like Beth mentioned, with core curriculum, it's really important to provide some descriptive details about what materials are and things. For students who are not yet at benchmark and they're being provided interventions, we really need to provide a level of detail so that parents feel comfortable knowing what is going on in school. So what do the instructional materials look like? And even going so far as to showing them the materials firsthand, maybe even doing a demonstration, modeling some of that can be really powerful for parents and families. We want to talk through the time, including their schedule. So we want to make sure that we are letting parents know that their child isn't going to be taken out of any core curriculum instruction. But also we need to be honest about if there's something that the student's not going to have access to or they're missing in their schedule because they are attending intervention at that time, and have that critical conversation about why we are prioritizing that intervention time. It's so critical. And then we can also provide information about the instructor, who that person is, and also their training and support, and how we are supporting that instructor to do the best specialized instruction for their child. Beth mentioned the various assessment pieces. So how will I know that this intervention is working? Like, wow, there's a lot of in-depth things that are going on to support my child. So we want to really be clear about what progress monitoring is, what are their goals, how do we develop that goal, the skills that we are focusing on, and also sharing those successes about when their student is mastering those specific skills. So seeing it visually in graph form can be another powerful way to share with parents and families. And also support planning. So sharing the details of the plan to support their student. So specifically within intervention, but also what's happening in core. How is it being differentiated? What other tools can their student access during core as well? So that holistic picture of how we're supporting. And it's also very important to get feedback on that plan and tap into the wisdom that the parents have. At home, again, families have told us and told advocacy groups, and we have heard in our professional lives that families really want to know specifically what they can do to support at home. And so I think the level of detail here is the difference to go from kind of doing something to really deeply enhancing our practice. So providing at-home materials and routines. So demonstrating, here's a strategy, like perhaps a student is working on fluency. That's one of the skills they're working on, and you're doing like a highlighter fluency building routine. You could actually teach and train essentially parents on how to do that mini routine and bring that into the home environment. And then that way the parents also really know that what they're doing is enhancing what their student is getting at the school. Also, families can celebrate improvements and give encouragement and inspiration, validate that the student is working hard, that they're proud of them. That is super important as well. We can share what other resources are available in the community. So as Beth said, there's different advocacy groups at the local level, the state level, national level. The internet is just a cornucopia of resources and wonderful things that parents can access. However, I think the level up difference for what we would advocate for is really carefully consider and curate what are those high impact parent resources, and also ensuring that our parents are accessing that, or that we think around barriers to accessing those, because not everyone has access to online resources. So some quick wins. This comes from Decoding Dyslexia. It's a great advocacy group. And this is guidance for staff. Now, this looks really familiar because we derived what I just spoke about directly from what we have heard across the nation from parents, what they want to hear, what they need to hear. So this is a nice guidance kind of checklist, and you can use this to hone in on maybe, like let's say we pick one about communicating progress monitoring results. Okay, maybe as a district, we create a template for how we're going to communicate that across all grade levels to enhance. So that could be a quick win. Another quick win is sharing resources. So again, these are from Decoding Dyslexia, and they have a wonderful bank of shorter and longer video resources, some that are more on the informational side, some that are on the more inspirational side. These are great. The content is very slick and professional. It's already been created, so it would be a quick win to share these out with some of your families. Okay, so what about families who speak another language at home? So what are some of those things that is beneficial for them to share with us in the school? Well, getting information about their child's level of literacy in their home language can really help us scaffold supports for their students. So thinking through their level of proficiency and comfort with listening. So are they able to listen and comprehend? Do they speak the language? Can they read in their home language or write in their home language? We know that students who can read and write or have a higher, stronger, more robust level of literacy in their home language are more able to connect and translate that to developing English proficiency and reading ability in English. So that is a very powerful thing to know about and to capitalize on. And then also acquiring about the level of language support that they as parents or caregivers, what they need. So for written materials, do they need that translated? Do they prefer that translated? Sometimes various families might want English and their home language, sometimes one or the other. Just tapping into what their preferences are. And then for meetings, it does, do the families need a interpreter present? So all of those kinds of things. That's not moving forward. There we go. Now you can see that. So what we can share with families who speak another language at home. This comes from, again, the research and evidence and parent advocacy groups, but also from my own personal experience with families who speak another language. I have heard the myth of that time and time again, that parents were really intimidated to help their students academically if they felt that they didn't have a firm enough grasp on the English language, or they weren't proficient enough, or they could understand English, but they didn't know how to read or have engaged really deeply academically. And so I think a really important thing to explicitly say again and again is that home and community language is an asset. It's not a barrier. It actually helps build a foundation from which students can flourish, and it's about part of who they are. And with that, we can share many of the ways that families can support literacy at home in the home language. So I'm going to show you a resource in just a second about that specifically. We can also share available multilingual resources within the community to help support overall literacy. And I think it's also nice to communicate with families about how we as staff or we as teachers are exploring and doing some research and kind of study into the various home languages that are present in our community, in our classrooms, and how we're familiarizing ourselves. We're taking the time to learn about that other language and see if there are some cross-language connections that we can use and leverage, or if there's some cross-cultural connections that helps kind of push students' development even faster and further. So that's another thing to share. Some quick wins in this area. On the left is a nice resource. I think both of these resources come from MTSS for ELs. It's great. There's things beyond these two resources, but these are some great examples. The one on the left, I really like. It's kind of set up in the quadrant, and it is for parents. They select the box that represents their ability to support their child as they read. And so there are different sets of suggestions based on whether the parent themselves can read and understand English. So there's things for if you can read and understand English, but there's also different suggestions, even if you as a parent feel like you don't have the proficiency to read or understand English, your child can still read in English to you, and you can engage in a variety of ways. So I think this is a really neat example. And then on the right is an example of a read aloud routine focused on building vocabulary and comprehension development and enhancement. And this is available in both English and in Spanish. So if you have a Spanish speaking community, this could be another great resource for you. And again, it's already created, it's already translated, it's a quick win. Okay, so thinking through now to those few families who have students who need intensive and individualized level of support. It's not advancing. There we go. So with this, there's a few key takeaways that we want to have you consider. The first is that all of the previous suggestions and considerations apply to these families. So they get all of the communication and support that all families get, as well as those with students who are not yet proficient readers would be getting. In addition to, the next takeaway is that the more intensive and more individualized that the students' supports are, that commensurately, the more intensive and individualized the communication needs to be about that plan for support. It is even more critical at this with these families to be very distinct, explicit, clear, and communication also needs to be more connected. So there may be more staff members that are each playing a part in supporting their child. And so there needs to be a more interconnectedness in that communication. And students who are having difficulty with learning to read, that can cause a strain on the student. It can cause a strain on families, and an emotional toll. And so it's even more important for us to strive for positive relationships with these families. And a way to do that is honoring their preferences and really taking the time to hold space and hear their concerns. And essentially, they just need a little extra TLC. So then kind of outside or beyond the differentiated triangle of supports, we also have communication. We want to think through how are we expanding our message and our partnerships to the broader community. So there are many things that we can share with our wider community friends. And, one of those pieces or a big portion is really sharing what we do, sharing our vision and our mission for literacy, why we are passionate about why literacy is so critical and so important, how we're teaching reading, how we're evaluating what we're doing, what is our process when students struggle. And another key piece here too is sharing those successes. So again, the wider community doesn't necessarily know all the level of detail of what we're doing within our doors, but if we are sharing our successes, like our data, our stories, our testimonials, really bringing that to life can make it very motivational for community members to feel like they are a part of something greater, that they're contributing, that partnering with us has an impact and is important. So I think that is definitely something that we want to share. And then we can also share how the community's resources can improve literacy too. So how can they help the mission? So we can partner with the wider community in a lot of different ways. This is a really neat opportunity, I think, to be creative and to think outside the box and kind of go beyond the invitation in and really start seeking out some of those relationships and connections. So who might we start embarking on this journey with or deepen this journey? Could be our school board is a natural example, and maybe just going more explicit and in deeper information with them. And I'll share some really neat work being done with school boards in a moment. The local library is another natural fit for a partnership. Advocacy groups that we talked about earlier, tribal leaders in your community, other community organizations that are already present, and even large employers. So our former colleague, Shelby DeFonso, was out in the Ontario School District, and one of their large employers in that community that employed many of the parents of their students was ORTIi, the potato company. And they actually worked with the company to allow workers some time off on their break to go to parent-teacher conferences at the facility. So teachers were flexible in the timing and the place of where parent-teacher conferences took place, and the employer offered some of that flexibility and invitation to invite school members in, so that parents could access that more readily without the challenges of timing and transportation. So that was really, really successful. So other ways we could do it is co-sponsorship of events, again, advocacy, after-school programs, family support groups and education classes, if there's something like that in your community, and even just sharing spaces. So having other places within your community be the physical space where parents can come and receive resources, especially literacy hubs, essentially, where they can see the materials and access things. So a lot of ideas here. So some quick wins: presentations at the school board. So we recently had a couple of our districts do some amazing work that we're sharing with you. We're so excited. Newburgh shared about MTSS, and why it's important to their school board. And so there's a little clip of that. You just skip ahead to the hour 45 mark. And Hood River, that was kind of a short and sweet way of bridging some of that information. Hood River recently did the big kit and caboodle, where they actually hosted their core review meetings during and with the school board. So the school board was able to see it in action, and it's super, super powerful. We highly recommend checking that out. So that is a link that is there for you as well. And essentially just think through, what do you have in your community? Are there things that are already established that you can kind of leverage? There we go. So we're going to send you off on another team time. This is going to be about 20 minutes again. Same kind of format. Now, again, I talked about how we communicate with some families, with few families, with the broader community. That's a lot to take on. So you probably want to focus your time. So select wisely. I'm sure you will. And kind of go through those same things in the graphic organizer. We will be able to pop in if you have questions.
And so in the beginning, Beth talked about how we can strengthen those family and community partnerships. So today, as Beth said, we really concentrated on those standards of practice. So about basically thinking through how do you want to communicate to all families, how you want to communicate to some families, few families, and then to the community, and also how we can get feedback from them about what we're doing in the schools as well. And those should be around the areas for what are we doing for core instruction? What are we doing for interventions, and how are we supporting kids? But just in a way that's understandable for families. And then getting more information about families, about what kind of communication is working for them, what's getting information from them about what might be understandable. If you're doing the parent-teacher conferences and where the teachers are presenting data to them, do the families understand that information? So we want to be thinking through those pieces. So that's going to be really your next step, is to really be concentrating on those standards of practice, as well as trying to remove some of those barriers. Then in the future, you want to be thinking about the professional learning for that. So how can you support teachers more in using those standards of practice, and then how are you going to monitor it in terms of, is our system working? Right. We can go. So, and then I think John showed this in the beginning. This is just that rubric piece. So we just want to show you how this information is connected to what we want districts to be thinking about and what helps sustainability. So again, it's just talking about those standards of practice and those barriers as the first places to concentrate on. And then Beth, if you click, talking later about the professional learning and the monitoring piece. So just to kind of wrap it up and summarize about how we actually build those standards of practice, and as Beth talked about, it's with the district implementation leadership team would be the ones to do that. And we'd really want to add the families to this piece and the community voice. This is more important than ever in this for building your standards of practice around this topic area. We probably didn't have that as much in this work when you started. And now it's just really critical to start to build that in. If they can attend, are there other ways you can get that information from them? And are you making different ways to get information from them and provide information? Sometimes that meetings are held during the day and the parents are working, they're not going to be able to attend that. So you can have some of those meetings in the evening where it's easier for them to attend, or provide childcare and those types of things. And we also just want to get those advocacy groups voiced too, if we can. So IDA is the International Dyslexia Association, and DD is Decoding Dyslexia. So they have some a great voice, and they really are in touch with how families are perceiving the schools and what families want to hear more about and learn about. And then there's also those feedback loops about kind of, as I was saying, getting that information back to the school and about what's working for families. And so what are the barriers? I know in my little group, we've been talking about some of the barriers. And so, some are resolve around just how, Becky, if you can click through all of them, time is a barrier for things, and funding can be a barrier. So the time, it's, we kind of talked about in my little group that, we want kids to read 20 minutes a day at home, but as parents, sometimes that can be difficult to dedicate that time. So there are small pieces of time that we can help parents understand that you can diffuse that throughout the day. Like you can do some phonemic awareness with them in the car, or you can have little flashcards with CBC words. And before you go leave with your child, you can have them go through a couple of flashcards and things like that. So just really be thinking about and how you can start to break down those barriers and think through them. And a lot of time we need to get the feedback from the parents to better understand what those barriers are. Okay. All right, so the next steps we're talking about is developing those standards of practice for family and community. And we're actually going to have you share a little bit of that at our next training on January 24th. So that's your goal, is to be able to have a draft of those standards of practice by that date. And it looks like some of you have been starting to write in the chat about your ahas are and what your barriers are. So that has been good. Do that. So yeah, one of the ahas that we talked about in my group was about bringing in the school board to possibly attend one of the core review meetings. You'd have to look into just how many people are attending to see if this could become a public meeting or not. But oftentimes those school board members don't really totally understand what the focus is with literacy, and that's a great way for them to understand it and understand what the needs of the school are. Okay. And then just the final takeaways that these partnerships are powerful. We know from research that partnering with families and community can make a big difference in student success. So kind of one of the ways to think about it is, we took this from the Reading League, and it talks about what do we want to invest in? What do we need to gain more knowledge around with our families, or just with how you partner with families? Then what can we anchor in? So there's going to be your standards of practice about what are we actually going to agree on as a school or district for consistency. And then what can we abandon? What are we doing that's not working? Are we doing things that, those parent literacy nights, we have it, but is it actually having impact that we want it to? To be able to do those things, we need to seek to understand what families' needs are and what they want. We also need to be honest and accurate with them. Sometimes it's the school is telling the parents, oh, your kid's doing great, but the data reflects something else. Parents need to know where their student is and where their child is and how they can support their child at home. We focus on what we can control. That's basically about, like, we can't be sort of, both sides can't be blaming each other. Well, the school's not doing this or the parent's not doing this. We can't control that. We should only focus on what we control, and that's focusing on solutions and moving forward with those solutions. Right, so coming up, so the next steps again just are that your coaches will contact you to have a to connect with you about doing this work with the standards of practice. We do have the Oregon RTI Reading Symposium on December 8th, and that will be live, but it also will be recorded. As I mentioned, the next Cadre 11 training will be on January 24th. And then our annual conference is going to be with Northwest PBS. And that's going to be the days with Northwest PBS are the 27th, the 28th, and actually they're going to have a pre-conference day on the 26th, which will have some workshops too, and we'll be connected with them with that too. And then just a reminder that your fall disaggregated data are due by November 15th. So we'd like to get that in, and then we'll be able to provide you with your funds for the first half of the year. And then there's the link for the feedback. You can click on it, or you can use the QR code. We really do pay attention to that feedback and look at it. And this way we can make changes to make things more meaningful and useful for you as we need to. So thank you for your time today. We're excited about this topic. We think it's really timely to be really addressing this now, and we're happy to support you in this work. So thank you.